What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm doing pretty good. Today we are going to be discussing how the New Testament Gospels aren't good evidence for historical Christ. We have to know when the books were written, who they were written by, if they were influenced by anyone, and how reliable they actually are. If you're interested in this, then please stay tuned. First off, we have to discuss what is good evidence. Good historical evidence has a very unique standard. I would like to introduce a mnemonic device for 3 measures of historical evidence called TIE. That's time, independence, and explanatory power. Using these 3 criteria for analyzing historical evidence, you can accurately judge how trustworthy and relevant a historical source is. First and foremost, the time between the supposed events happening and the evidence must be as short as possible. Pieces of evidence that occur closer to the event is considered more reliable. For example, the Gospel of Mark is considered to be a more accurate depiction of the early Jewish Christian beliefs than the other Gospels, because it was written around 70 AD while the others were written much later than that. It's also important to note that Matthew and Luke contain portions of Mark verbatim, so it's evident that this information was copied from the first Gospel. Another way that you can tell that these Gospels are less reliable sources is by how much they deviate from actual reality. Matthew, Luke, and John are more magical Gospels than Mark because they have more supernatural elements in them. For instance, in one section of Mark, you have Jesus going to a town and he could not do any magic works there, while in the other Gospels he goes to the same town and he is turned away. Thus, it's not about him not being able to do it, but rather they rejected Jesus. Generally, the more time between a source and the supposed event, the more likely it is to deviate from the source, event, or person, like we see with the subsequent Gospels. But even Mark doesn't escape this, because he had Paul's theology, being written in the 50s, and the scriptures, written hundreds of years earlier, to inform him. We know this because a lot of Paul's theology shows up in Mark. And Mark, the gospel itself, actually cites scriptures at the very beginning of his gospel rather than historical sources. If the amount of time between a source and the supposed event or person is too long, the more likely it is to be corrupted by already existing documents, tales, or theology. This leads us to our next letter in our mnemonic device, and that's I for independence. In order for something to be considered a good, reliable source, it has to be an independent account. The Gospels of Matthew, Luke, and John are not independent accounts for a few various reasons. First, they are later compositions that correct Mark's Gospel. If a source precedes another source, then the former could inform the latter, and therefore cannot be considered a separate independent source. This is why the claim that so many thousands of manuscripts existing simply cannot be considered a good, reliable source. All are copies of the same source material. So you really don't have thousands of manuscripts. You only have one copy of each gospel, and none of them, save for maybe the first one, Mark, can be considered a separate independent source. This is why Paul's writings in the New Testament and not the Gospels would be considered the only true independent source in the New Testament. Paul emphasizes that he got his information from no person on earth. According to Paul, the only way to get information about the Christ is through revelation and scripture. This is why in Mark's gospel, you have him referencing prophecies from the scriptures rather than human sources. Scripture and visions of the risen Jesus were considered to be more reliable than human testimony. The final letter in our mnemonic device is E for explanatory power. Explanatory power is the ability of a hypothesis to explain the subject. There are various ways to measure the explanatory power of a source. Using more facts and observations while creating the least amount of assumptions is a good enough criteria for our purposes today. A lot of people characterize this as Occam's razor, and in essence it is. But many misunderstand Occam's razor. They think that the simpler a hypothesis is, the more likely it is to be true. For instance, it's like saying that it's more likely that just some Jesus preacher existed as the start of the religion because it's simpler than one being made up. But this is not an accurate description of Occam's razor. Occam's razor actually states that the hypothesis, out of competing hypotheses, that uses the most facts and observations while creating the least amount of assumptions is most likely to be correct. For example, the hypothesis that Paul just simply lied when he said that he didn't get his information from any human source is far less probable than just taking Paul at his word. This is because it adds the assumption that Paul lies in his writings to other Christians. What else did Paul lie about? Could he be lying when he met Cephas and James? Could he just be lying about his entire theology? See, this creates way more questions than it actually answers. So again, it's much more likely that Paul was speaking honestly because it requires the least amount of assumptions. And there you have it, a quick and easy mnemonic device that can help you analyze historical sources. Time, independence, and explanatory power. The New Testament Gospels mostly cannot give us any good information about the life of Jesus because they date nearly 40 years after he supposedly died. They were either informed by earlier Gospels like Mark or the existing theology of Paul, and they also fail to provide any kind of explanatory power because they only invoke more questions than they answer. Next time, we're going to be looking at how Marabar Serapion doesn't actually prove that Jesus existed using the 3 criteria that we established today. So please tune in then to learn about that. Thank you, Heathens, for joining in today. I would love to see your conversations in the comments below. I know a lot of you are pro-mythicist and a lot of you are anti-mythicist. So please have those conversations down there. I would love to read them. While you're down there, make sure you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice, and I will see you heathens later.